Welcome to our channel, the place where dramatic, inspiring, and unexpected stories are always waiting for you. Today, you will witness a journey that will leave anyone feeling satisfied and vindicated. A talented and powerful Black CEO, mocked and belittled by a billionaire white family in front of everyone. But instead of bowing her head in silence, she chose a path that shocked the entire world, boldly canceling a $1 billion deal, turning their mockery into a stunning counterattack. This story will take you through each gripping chapter, from the humiliation to the schemes and power plays behind closed doors, and finally to the incredible comeback that silenced those who mocked her. This is not just a business journey, but a living testament to pride, intelligence, and the strength that can never be crushed. If you want to fully experience the thrill, the surprises, and the sweet satisfaction of seeing the underdog rise and flip the game, then this is the story for you. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button so you won't miss any journey, because every story here will leave you even more amazed and captivated. On a warm afternoon in New York, the Grand Hotel ballroom hosting the Tycoon's fundraising gala glittered like a Broadway stage. Crystal chandeliers sparkled against champagne glasses, casting a glow of luxury that only those born into wealth considered ordinary. Among the sea of tailored suits and gowns, heavy enough to cost a small car, one woman stood apart, Kiara Johnson, a young Black CEO, confident, her sharp eyes as if they could cut through a $1 billion contract with just a glance. She wasn't here to flaunt dresses or collect shallow compliments. Kiara came for one purpose: to finalize a $1 billion deal with the Harrington dynasty, one of the wealthiest white families in America. But as the saying goes, in a room full of people who believe they hold absolute power, there will always be someone arrogant enough to think they can belittle others. And so it was. The moment Kiara approached the Harringtons' table, the air shifted. Richard Harrington, the silver-haired billionaire, sitting in the center like a king without a crown, looked her up and down. He let out a smirk, sweet on the surface but dripping with contempt. "Well, isn't this the little CEO the press calls Wall Street's prodigy?" Richard announced loudly, making sure the entire table heard. Laughter erupted, clinking like glassware, cold and hollow. One of his nieces, draped in a gown that sparkled like the Milky Way, chimed in. "I heard she signs contracts faster than the wind. But who would trust a whole $1 billion to someone barely taller than a credit card?" The table burst into laughter, openly mocking her. To them, Kiara wasn't just a woman. She was a Black woman, an outsider in their lily-white world of power. What should have been a simple contract signing turned into a stage for ridicule. They laughed at her height, her skin, and the lack of pedigree they had already decided she must have. But if they thought those taunts would make Kiara retreat, they were dead wrong. Her gaze stayed calm, her lips curving into a razor-sharp smile. In Kiara's mind, every laugh wasn't a wound, it was fuel, stoking the fire that would soon erupt into a storm. At that moment, no one realized that every cruel word was the first nail in the coffin of the $1 billion deal the Harrington family was about to lose. The mocking laughter still lingered in the air as the waiter poured more wine at the table. Kiara didn't look rattled, not one bit. Instead, she watched carefully, as if storing every little detail in her memory. She knew one thing for sure. The ones laughing the loudest tonight would be the same ones forced into silence tomorrow. One of the Harrington uncles, infamous for his arrogance, raised his champagne glass with a smirk. "I guess you're here to thank us for giving you a chance to play in the grown-ups game, right?" The table burst into laughter again, as if that line were the funniest joke of the evening. Kiara kept her soft smile, but her eyes told a different story. Cold, restrained, like a fire waiting to ignite, she slowly set her glass down, lifted her chin, and spoke in a calm but steady voice that carried through the noise. "An opportunity? How interesting. I'd say it's the Harrington family who should be thanking me for letting you into a deal the whole country will remember." For a brief moment, the crowded room fell silent, as if the air itself had been cut. The laughter vanished. Eyes turned to her, some shocked, some annoyed, and others simply curious. A few guests at nearby tables even leaned closer, eager to catch every word. Richard Harrington cleared his throat. trying to claw back his authority in front of the crowd. "Young lady," he stressed every word, "you need to learn humility. In this world, people like you don't last long." Unfazed, Kiara let out a daring smile, her eyes glowing like embers. "Maybe you're right. But sometimes, one fleeting moment is all it takes to forever change the game for those who think they're untouchable." The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating, like a velvet curtain about to fall in a theater. No more laughter, no more jokes, only the thick tension that told everyone watching. This party had just turned into the opening act of a brutal showdown. Rumors at a Billionaire's gala spread faster than the wine being poured. Just minutes after Kiara's razor-sharp comeback, groups of guests were already whispering, their eager eyes darting toward the Harringtons' table, waiting for the next act to unfold. A middle-aged businesswoman leaned toward her friend and whispered, "Did she just say that to Richard Harrington? His face looks like it's about to blow up." And it was true. Richard forced a smile, but the way his fingers tapped on his glass gave away the anger boiling underneath. He was used to being praised, never challenged, especially not by a woman, and certainly not by a black woman in front of a crowded dinner table. One of the Harrington sons, maybe in his 30s, decided to cut in. "That's bold. Kiara, but are you sure you understand the rules here? At these tables, we don't just buy and sell companies. We decide who gets to play and who gets kicked out." The table erupted with knowing chuckles, as if his words were some kind of final verdict. But Kiara didn't flinch. Instead, she lifted her wine glass, gave the dark red liquid a slow swirl, and smiled. Lucky me, sitting with the so-called deciders of fate. But here's what you're forgetting. Real power doesn't sit in those chairs of yours. It sits in the choice I'm about to make. Her words sliced through the air like a knife. A few guests nearby gasped out loud. What was supposed to be a night of polite handshakes had turned into an underground arena, where every word from Kiara landed like an arrow, piercing the Harringtons' pride. And when Richard's eyes locked on hers, everyone watching could feel it. This wasn't a dinner party anymore. It was the opening round of a billion-dollar war. The air inside the room had turned thick. Guests who had been laughing moments ago now sat in silence, holding their breath for the finale. The crystal chandeliers still shone brightly, but now the light seemed to highlight every vein of fury running across Richard Harrington's face. He slammed his glass onto the table, the sound of crystal hitting wood cutting through the silence. "Who do you think you are?" Richard growled, his eyes burning with anger. "You should remember, no deal is ever done without the Harrington signature. And if you dare challenge us, you will pay the price." Whispers spread quickly across the room. Guests exchanged glances, nervous yet thrilled, as if they were watching a play that could end in an explosion at any second. Kiara didn't flinch. Instead, she rose to her feet and calmly adjusted her fitted black blazer. Every move she made carried a cold, commanding confidence, as if she were the one sitting at the top of the table. "Mr. Harrington," Kiara said, her voice steady and terrifyingly calm, "maybe you've forgotten something. This deal exists not because of you, but because of me. And if I want, it can end right here, tonight, at this very party." The entire room froze. You could hear the quickened breaths, even the sound of silverware pausing mid-air on polished plates. Kiara turned, her gaze sweeping across some of the most powerful faces in America. Then she left them with one line that locked every jaw in place. Sometimes, the only way to teach the arrogant a lesson is to take away the very thing they value most. She smiled, lifted her glass for one final sip, and walked away, leaving behind a heavy silence and the stunned faces of the Harrington dynasty. The other guests whispered to each other, knowing full well this was no longer just a business deal. This was the beginning of a war, where $1 billion was only the tip of the iceberg. The next morning, New York's biggest financial papers all ran stories about the Tycoon's gala. But instead of covering the fundraising deals, every headline centered on one thing: the showdown between Black CEO Kiara Johnson and the billionaire Harrington family. Bold headlines splashed across the pages. The black CEO who challenged the Harrington dynasty in the middle of the gala. $1 billion on the table and one line that stunned the room. Who really holds the power in this deal? Financial networks buzzed with commentary. Some analysts praised Kiara's boldness, saying she had proven herself a leader who could stand toe-to-toe with America's most powerful families. But others doubted her, mocking, "She went too far." The market doesn't forgive those who insult the Harringtons. Meanwhile, social media exploded. Short clips capturing Kiara's sharp response to Richard spread like wildfire. Everyone, from business students to office workers, shared the moment with captions like, "Pure satisfaction. First time I've ever seen someone talk back to the Harringtons like that." She's not just smart, she's fearless. Across town, Kiara sat in her office, staring out the window as the morning sun lit up the skyscrapers. Her phone buzzed non-stop with messages from advisors, partners, and even rivals. But Kiara stayed silent. She knew the truth. The real storm hadn't even started. What happened at the gala was only lightning on the horizon, warning of the thunder that was about to crash down. And this time she wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for everyone who had ever been underestimated like her. Less than 24 hours later, the Harrington family struck back. Their loyal media outlets suddenly rolled out a wave of hit pieces with headlines dripping with malice. Kiara Johnson, ambition out of control. Is a young CEO really ready to handle a $1 billion deal? On financial talk shows, Harrington-friendly experts were paraded in to sow doubt. Sure, she's smart, but she's inexperienced. One wrong move and her company could collapse like a house of cards. One tabloid even mocked with a headline, "Tiny CEO takes on billionaire empire. Will this fairy tale end in tears?" Meanwhile, Kiara's company's stock began to wobble. Nervous investors sold off shares, fearing the Harringtons could easily crush any rival bold enough to challenge them. But what the Harringtons didn't expect was Kiara's silence. No statements, no press conferences. She let the media roar, as if they were the ones burning themselves alive with their own arrogance and haste. At her office, advisors urged her to hit back immediately. But Kiara only smiled, her eyes gleaming with resolve. Relax. The louder they get, the more their fear shows. And when the time comes, we'll show them what real power looks like. 3 days later, while smear articles about Kiara still flooded the news, she shocked everyone by announcing a press conference right at her company's headquarters. No build-up, just a short statement. CEO Kiara Johnson will announce her decision regarding the $1 billion deal. Reporters packed the lobby wall to wall. Cameras panned across faces filled with curiosity, worry, and even smug anticipation of her downfall. Some Harrington-friendly journalists already had their headlines drafted, "The End of the Power Challenger." But when Kiara stepped onto the stage, dressed in a sharp black suit and eyes blazing with focus, the room fell silent. She didn't dodge. She didn't sugarcoat. Her very first sentence stunned the crowd. "The Harrington family may think they're in control. But the truth is, I've decided to walk away from this deal. $1 billion isn't worth my pride," the room erupted. Cameras flashed nonstop. Reporters shouted over one another, hands raised with microphones. "Are you serious? You're really walking away from $1 billion?" Kiara smiled, her voice steady and firm. "Yes, I won't sell my respect. And I won't buy their contempt. The market will see. Some things are worth more than money." Her declaration hit the financial world like a bomb. And the biggest surprise? Instead of tanking, Kiara's company stock shot upward that very afternoon. Investors realized a CEO willing to give up $1 billion to protect her dignity, that's someone worth betting on. While the press and social media buzzed with the news of Kiara walking away from the deal, the mood inside the Harrington family's lavish estate was darker than ever. Richard Harrington sat in the closed boardroom, his face flushed with rage. On the table lay a scatter of newspapers with headlines screaming, "Kiara Johnson cancels $1 billion deal." Each one cut into his pride like a blade. "She dared to humiliate us in front of the entire world," Richard growled, slamming his fist on the table so hard the glasses rattled. "Now the whole country sees us as the ones left behind." This is an insult I will never forget. His eldest son, Edward, tried to keep his composure, but his voice shook with anger. Father, we can't let this go. If she gets away with it, other CEOs will think they can stand up to the Harringtons too. Another family member chimed in. We could push the banks to pull their funding, or lobby the government to investigate her company. Give it a few weeks and we can choke off her cash flow, force her to her knees. Richard leaned back in his chair, his eyes as cold and sharp as a blade. No, I don't just want her struggling. I want her destroyed. She will pay dearly for turning the Harrington name into a joke. In the shadows of that opulent room, a plan for revenge began to take shape, and across the city, Kiara had no idea that the real storm was about to break. A week after the explosive press conference, Kiara's company began to feel the weight of invisible pressure. First came the banks. One of their longtime financial partners suddenly announced a review of credit terms, freezing the company's cash flow overnight. No explanation, just a cold email, as if the decision had been made long before. Then came the government. Out of nowhere, a regulatory agency declared a full inspection of the company's operations. Letters, summons, official phone calls, they poured in all at once. Harrington-friendly media wasted no time twisting the news. Maybe the fearless young CEO isn't as strong as she pretends to be. Inside the office, employees whispered nervously. Some of the younger staff muttered to each other, "What if the company really goes under? Are we about to lose our jobs?" The atmosphere was tight, like a guitar string pulled to the point of snapping. But Kiara stayed calm. She walked into the boardroom where her top managers sat waiting, their eyes full of worry. "We won't deny the challenges," Kiara said, her voice warm but firm. "But remember this, they want us afraid, they want us shaken. Our job is to show the world we don't go down that easily." Her words didn't just cut through the tension, they lit a spark. Because deep down, her team knew, if anyone could turn pressure into power, it was Kiara Johnson. A few days later, the Harrington counterattack exploded on national television. Richard Harrington appeared in a live interview, dressed in a crisp gray suit, his voice calm but dripping with disdain. He looked straight into the camera, his eyes sharp with calculation. "We've always respected young, talented CEOs. But unfortunately, some let their egos outweigh their judgment. $1 billion isn't child's play, and when someone inexperienced walks away from such an opportunity, it's clear they don't have what it takes to play at the top." His words were a blade aimed directly at Kiara. Harrington-friendly outlets immediately echoed with headlines. Richard Harrington, Kiara Johnson, not fit for a $1 billion deal. Ego destroys the career of the black CEO on social media. The public split in two. Some mocked Kiara, saying she was too arrogant. Others were outraged, rallying to her defense. "He's the arrogant one." Kiara walking away from $1 billion to keep her dignity. That's more powerful than any deal. In her office, Kiara sat watching the interview replay. Her entire team sat in silence, waiting for her reaction. After a moment, Kiara let out a laugh, a sharp, unshaken laugh. "He thinks he's landed a killing blow," she said, her tone laced with irony. "But in truth, all he proved is this: Harrington is afraid. And when the most powerful man in the room resorts to TV attacks on a woman, that's the clearest sign his empire is trembling." After Richard Harrington's interview, the financial world assumed Kiara would back down. They were wrong. 3 days later, she sent out invitations to major media outlets, announcing a special event at the New York Convention Center. No one knew exactly what it was about, but the name Kiara Johnson alone was enough to make it the hottest ticket in town. On the day of the event, the hall was packed. Reporters crammed together, cameras lined the aisles, and even powerful investors showed up, curious to see what the stubborn CEO would do next. When Kiara walked onto the stage, the tension snapped tight. She wore a sharp white suit in stark contrast to Harrington's dark and brooding TV appearance. She smiled and began a speech that never mentioned the Harringtons by name, but every word was aimed squarely at them. In business, real power doesn't just belong to old dynasties or names that have lasted for centuries. True power comes from the trust of the market, from resilience, and from putting human values above money. She paused, looking straight into the cameras. Her voice rang clear. Today, I'm announcing a new $500 million investment fund, built to support small businesses, the ones who've been mocked, underestimated, but still found the courage to rise. The room erupted. Applause thundered, reporters shouted over each other. And on social media, the hashtag #I'mStandWithKiara began to trend worldwide. Across the city, as the news broke, Richard Harrington slammed his newspaper down on the table. He couldn't believe it. Kiara had just turned his attack into the very platform that lifted her higher than ever. That night, inside the Harrington Mansion's private boardroom, the air was thick, like a storm on the verge of breaking. On the giant screen, footage of Kiara announcing her $500 million fund played back. The sound of roaring applause making Edward Harrington furious enough to hurl his glass of wine to the floor. She just made us into clowns in front of the whole world, Edward snarled. Nobody's talking about her failure anymore. They're all praising her courage and that damn fund. Richard sat silent for a moment, his hands clasped together, his cold eyes fixed on the screen. Finally he spoke, his voice gravelly but commanding. We underestimated her. Kiara Johnson isn't just a reckless CEO. She's smart enough to turn her weakness into a weapon. And that makes her even more dangerous. A nephew spoke up. So what do we do, Uncle? Keep hitting her in the press? Richard shook his head, slowly rising to his feet, his shadow stretching long across the floor. No, words aren't enough anymore. If she wants to turn the market into a battlefield, then we'll show her what real war looks like. He turned to Edward, his eyes like blades. Get everything ready. I want the banks, the partner funds, the politicians we own, every one of them, to come down on Kiara at once. When this storm hits, she'll have no way out. In that dim-lit room, a new plot was set into motion. And across the city, Kiara had no idea that the next chapter of this war would be far more ruthless than anything she had yet faced. Monday morning, the moment Kiara stepped into her office, her assistant rushed up to her, face pale. CEO, 3 major banks just pulled our credit lines. And we also received documents from the tax authorities, demanding a full audit of all our financial records. The boardroom that followed descended into chaos. Senior managers rattled off reports, suppliers delaying shipments because of financing issues, an investment fund suddenly pulling out, and worst of all, a politician tied to the Harringtons publicly accusing Kiara's company of lacking transparency. The news hit like knives, one after another, piercing the team's confidence. A young manager blurted out in panic, "If this keeps up, we won't survive a month." But Kiara sat there, unnervingly calm. She placed her hands on the table and spoke slowly, each word solid as stone. This is the counterattack I've been waiting for. They want us to collapse quickly, but they've forgotten something. I've been preparing for the worst-case scenario since day one. Her gaze swept across the room, steadying the fearful faces around her. Then she smiled, a smile without the slightest tremor. The Harringtons think they've cornered me, but the truth is, they've just handed me the chance to prove what real strength looks like. 2 days later, while headlines still screamed about the crisis of Kiara Johnson, she shocked everyone by showing up at the New York Stock Exchange. No big build-up, no flashy announcements, just a short statement. CEO Kiara Johnson will announce a new financial strategy. The press swarmed the floor, cameras aimed squarely at her. Everyone assumed she would admit defeat or beg for help, but when Kiara stepped up to the podium, she smiled brightly, her eyes blazing like she already owned the game. They say my company is on the verge of collapse, Kiara began, her voice ringing out. But here's the news. Today, we are officially announcing a strategic partnership with 3 leading Asian tech giants. Total investment, $700 million. The room erupted. Reporters shouted, microphones shot up, and within minutes, social media exploded. The hashtag Kiara700M lit up Twitter. She went on, her tone laced with irony. Maybe some people thought they had me cornered. But the truth is, they just pushed me to be more creative, bolder, and stronger than ever. On the giant ticker screens, her company's stock spiked upward, the glowing green numbers flashing like a slap across the Harringtons' face. And across the city, for the first time, the powerful dynasty felt real fear. Inside the Harringtons' lavish mansion, rage exploded. On the giant screen, news stations replayed Kiara's $700 million announcement, her company's stock shooting upward like a rocket. Edward slammed his hand on the table, shouting, "She just turned failure into victory. Now the whole world sees her as a hero. If we don't act, the Harrington name will be a joke." Another family member snapped, "We can flood the media with more attacks, spread doubts about that deal. There's bound to be a weakness we can exploit." Richard stayed quiet for a long moment, his eyes dark but dangerous. Then he rose, his gravelly voice cutting like a blade. "No, it's time to move past public games. From now on, we strike in the shadows. If we can't crush her on the stock exchange, we'll crush her in real life." He turned to Edward, his gaze icy cold. "Dig into Kiara's past. Find everything, old friends, old rivals, anyone she's ever crossed. I want dirt, a secret, a flaw, something we can use to shatter the image she's building." The room grew suffocatingly heavy. One by one, the family members nodded, fully aware they were about to launch a dirty war, one where the prize wasn't money, but the total destruction of a woman's reputation. And while Kiara basked in the glow of her triumph, the shadows had already begun to circle, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Just days after Kiara announced her $700 million deal, whispers began creeping across Wall Street. At first, it was nothing more than murmurs in finance cafes. Heard Kiara was caught up in a scandal at her old company. Then came anonymous posts on social media, throwing out vague accusations. Is CEO Kiara Johnson hiding a controversial past? Soon, the rumors spread like wildfire, from shady financial dealings to outrageous lies about her personal life. Tabloids splashed the headlines with glee. What truths are hiding behind the billion-dollar CEO's shine? In the office, a manager laid down a stack of papers in front of Kiara, his voice uneasy. "Ma'am, if we don't address this, these rumors will become weapons against the company." Kiara sat silent for a moment, her cold eyes scanning the slanderous lines. She let out a quiet sigh, then smiled faintly, half in disdain, half in challenge. "They're scared now. Rumors are the weapons of the weak. But they've forgotten one thing." She looked up, her gaze sharp as steel. "Rumors can spread fear, but truth, if used the right way, can destroy an empire." Somewhere in the shadows, the Harringtons were surely smiling in triumph. But what they didn't know was that Kiara was already preparing to turn their dirty weapon into a double-edged blade. Monday morning, while tabloids kept churning out headlines about the secret past of Kiara Johnson, she walked into the boardroom with a calmness that unsettled everyone. Around the table, her executives looked tense. "CEO," one advisor began nervously, "the rumors are spreading fast. If we don't shut them down now, we could lose investor confidence." Kiara didn't answer right away. She stood, walked to the whiteboard, and wrote 3 words in bold: truth, media, timing. Then she turned back, her eyes blazing. "Rumors only have power when we let them live in the dark. To destroy them, we bring the truth into the light." She unveiled a bold plan: host a public forum, inviting the press, investors, and even rivals. There, Kiara would tell her own story, her failures, her scars, and the tough choices she had made. "We won't hide," Kiara declared. "We'll turn weakness into strength. I'll show them I'm not perfect, but I am transparent. And that transparency will be the weapon Harrington can't fight." Around the table, tense faces began to ease. One young manager blurted out, "If you do that, they'll have nothing left to use against you. You'll flip the script." Kiara smiled, calm but proud. "Exactly. They throw mud at me, but I'll turn it into cement to build an even stronger foundation for my empire." On the day of the public forum, the hall was packed. Reporters, investors, business students, and even the simply curious filled every seat, everyone eager to hear what Kiara Johnson would say in the face of the rumor storm. When Kiara walked onto the stage, the lights shone on her face, calm but full of resolve. She didn't hide. She didn't deliver a polished corporate speech. Instead, she began with a truth that stunned the room into silence. Yes, I've failed. At 25, I started my first company, and it went bankrupt in 2 years. I lost everything. I slept in my office. I was called a useless dreamer. The crowd stirred. Some reporters scribbled furiously, others looked up in surprise. Kiara pressed on, her voice growing stronger. But it was those scars that taught me to rise again. It was those humiliations that made me resilient. And today, I'm not here to prove I'm perfect. I'm here to prove I'm not afraid of the truth. She paused, locking eyes with the cameras. The Harringtons can invent lies. They can twist narratives, but they can't erase this fact. I've fallen and I've risen. And I'll keep rising again and again until they're exhausted from trying to knock me down. Thunderous applause erupted across the hall. On social media, clips of her speech spread like wildfire. Within hours, the hashtag #TruthWithKiara shot to the top of the trends. Meanwhile, in the Harrington mansion, Richard slammed the remote onto the table as he watched Kiara being celebrated. For the first time, he realized the media war was no longer his to control. Overnight, Kiara's forum became a phenomenon. TV networks replayed her speech on loop, while social media flooded with supportive comments. She's real. No fakery, no cover-ups. That's why I trust her. The Harringtons may be rich, but Kiara has heart and transparency. I'll stand with her. Her company's stock kept climbing while the Harrington family's image began to crack. People whispered, why would such a wealthy dynasty need to rely on rumors to bring down one woman? Neutral outlets started leaning toward Kiara, while hit pieces against her were mocked as the desperate attempts of the weak. Then came the bombshell. Senator David Collins, a heavyweight in economic policy, tweeted his support for Kiara. In business, transparency matters more than power. I stand with Kiara Johnson for having the courage to face the truth. That single tweet hit like an earthquake. Investors instantly saw it as a signal. Kiara wasn't standing alone anymore. On Wall Street, the buzz was clear. With a senator of that caliber on her side, the Harringtons couldn't play dirty again without serious scrutiny. In her office, when her assistant delivered the news, Kiara simply smiled. She knew this wasn't just personal support. It was a sign that the balance of power was starting to shift. Inside the Harrington mansion, an emergency meeting was called late at night. No whine, no mocking laughter. The air was so heavy it felt like the room itself was swallowing them whole. On the giant screen was Senator David Collins' tweet. Blown up so large, the words almost leapt off the display. Edward slammed his hand on the table. This is a disaster! A politician like Collins siding with Kiara means we'll be under a microscope. If we keep playing dirty, it'll backfire on us. Another family member tried to salvage the mood. Maybe we can use money to buy his silence, or at least undermine Collins' credibility. Richard cut him off, his gravelly voice booming. Enough! Collins isn't someone you can just buy. He chose Kiara not just because of her, but because he sees the future in her. That's what should worry us. He rose, pacing slowly around the table, his eyes heavy with thought. We made a mistake turning her into a victim. Now the public sees Kiara as a symbol against arrogance. If we keep pushing, we'll only dig our own grave. Edward clenched his jaw and asked, Then what do we do, Father? Richard stopped, staring up at the chandelier glittering coldly like a crown of diamonds. Finally, he exhaled, a thin smile curling on his lips. From now on, we change tactics. No more trying to destroy her with rumors. We'll drag her into a game she can't win, a business war played by rules we wrote. The room fell silent. Everyone understood. A new storm was coming. And this time, the Harringtons wouldn't just strike from the shadows. They would pull Kiara into the battlefield itself. It was a gloomy morning on Wall Street when the market suddenly shook with breaking news. The Harringtons announced a brand new $5 billion investment fund, aimed directly at the same sector Kiara's company was leading. Headlines screamed across the networks, Harrington declares open war. Can Kiara survive the financial giant's strike? The numbers told the story in cold print. Harrington's stock soared, while Kiara's company dipped as nervous investors worried she couldn't withstand the onslaught. Inside her office, the management team sat in suffocating tension. The CFO spoke with a trembling voice. "They're not hiding anymore. This is a direct attack. With $5 billion, they could swallow the entire market within months." All eyes turned to Kiara. She stood by the window, watching the rush of people below on Wall Street. Her arms folded, her gaze sharp as a blade. After a long pause, she turned back, her voice steady and commanding. "The Harringtons think money decides everything. But they've forgotten one thing. The market doesn't just buy numbers, it buys trust. And trust is still ours." The room stayed silent, but in her team's eyes, fear slowly gave way to determination. Everyone knew the open war had begun, and this time, it wasn't just Kiara versus the Harringtons. It was a battle for the heart of the entire market. Inside the closed boardroom, Kiara spread a market map across the table. On the board, she marked red arrows pointing to the sectors targeted by Harrington's $5 billion fund: fintech, clean energy, and digital infrastructure. "This is their plan," Kiara said firmly. "They want to swallow everything, build a monopoly. But we're not going to play their game. We'll hit them where they least expect it." She pointed to a small box on the chart, an area often overlooked: mid- and small-sized tech startups. The Harringtons only care about the big fish. But the little ones, that's where the future lies. We'll invest in them directly, partner with them, nurture them, turn them into allies. A small but united army can be tougher than any mountain of money. A marketing director hesitated. "But investors might worry. They prefer safety over risk." Kiara smiled, her eyes burning with confidence. "Then we'll turn risk into vision. Investors don't just put money into profit, they put money into stories. And our story will be this: fighting monopoly, building a fair market, giving the underestimated a chance to rise." The room fell silent. Then slowly heads began to nod. Eyes lit up around the table. They realized Kiara wasn't just laying out a business strategy, she was igniting a movement. That day, the New York Convention Center was packed once again. Journalists, investors, even young CEOs from across the country gathered to hear what Kiara Johnson would say after the Harringtons' $5 billion strike. Kiara stepped onto the stage in a navy blue suit, the lights casting a glow on her determined face. She didn't waste time. She went straight to the point. "The Harringtons believe power lies in controlling the big corporations, in building monopolies. But I believe in a different kind of power, the power of small businesses, overlooked innovators, and dreams that haven't yet been heard." The hall fell silent. Then Kiara raised her hand, and the screen behind her lit up with the words, "Rising Stars Fund, $1 billion for small and mid-sized startups." The room erupted in cheers. Reporters rushed forward, snapping photos, while social media exploded with the hashtag #Rising with Kiara. She continued, her voice full of fire. "This isn't just an investment. This is a promise that everyone deserves a chance. We're not just fighting monopoly, we're rewriting the rules of the game." Young founders in the crowd leapt to their feet, clapping until their hands turned red. Some even shouted, "Thank you, Kiara. Finally, someone believes in us." In that moment, Kiara wasn't just a CEO anymore. She was a symbol. A banner leading a new wave against the arrogance of old money dynasties. Inside the Harrington Mansion's private chamber, the tension was suffocating. On the massive screen, clips of Kiara's Rising Stars Fund launch played on repeat, the cheers and applause stabbing at the family's pride like needles. Edward slammed his fist on the table in rage. "She's turning herself into a saint. Now all of America sees Kiara as the symbol of fairness and hope. If we don't act, the Harrington name will lose its dominance." Another relative snapped, "We've spread rumors. We've attacked her head-on in the market, and she's still standing. What now? What's left to do?" Richard sat in silence, his aged face hard as stone. Slowly, he pulled out a cigar, lit it, took a deep drag, and finally spoke. "She wants to be a symbol? Then we'll destroy the symbol. Not with money, not with rumors, Will strike at the very people she's sworn to protect. The room went still. Edward frowned. You mean, go after the startups she's backing? Richard nodded, his eyes cold as ice. Exactly. We'll buy them out, bankrupt them, or strangle them with regulations. When those little stars start to fall, Kiara will be left with nothing but a broken dream. And when that happens, the crowd will turn on her. A cruel smile spread across Richard's face. While the world outside was hailing Kiara as a hero, the Harrington dynasty was preparing their most ruthless strike yet. Bad news came faster than Kiara expected. Just 1 week after the Rising Stars Fund launch, 2 of her newly signed startups were already in trouble. A health tech company suddenly had its approved bank loan pulled. No explanation, just vague new internal policies. A green energy startup was hit with a surprise environmental inspection, forcing its production line to halt. Everyone knew the Harringtons' hand was behind it. In her office, the young founders called in desperation, their voices cracking. We've poured everything into this. Without help, we're finished. Please, Ms. Johnson, we need you. Hearing those words, Kiara gripped the phone tightly, her chest tightening. She knew these weren't just small companies. They were the symbols of trust she had promised the market. If they collapsed, not only would the startups fall, but her credibility would crumble too. Kiara stood by the window, staring at the rush of cars below. Her face hardened, her eyes burning with steel determination. All right, she said firmly. If the Harringtons want to play dirty, then I'll show them what it means to stand with the underdogs. Starting today, we're not just an investment fund, we're a shield. In that moment, Kiara was no longer just a CEO, she became a protector, ready to take on an empire to keep her promise. The very next morning, Kiara summoned her entire financial and legal advisory team. Thick files on each struggling startup were spread across the table. We don't have time, Kiara said firmly. If one small company collapses, the Harringtons will use it as proof to spread fear. I want an emergency support package immediately. Within 48 hours, Kiara went public. The Rising Stars Fund would set aside $200 million for a startup defense fund, ready to cover operating costs, compensate losses, and provide legal protection for any company in her network hit by suspicious attacks. The press conference landed like a bomb on Wall Street. Reporters shouted questions over one another. Do you see this as a direct response to the Harringtons? Aren't you worried you're burning money for nothing? Kiara smiled and answered simply, I don't call it burning money. I call it investing in resilience. A market is only truly strong when even its smallest players have the chance to survive. Almost instantly, a wave of support surged. Startups across the country publicly thanked her. On social media, the hashtag #ShieldOfKiara trended worldwide. Independent outlets hailed her as the savior of the underdogs in business. Meanwhile, at the Harrington estate, Richard watched the headlines with a dark scowl. He muttered through clenched teeth, She turns every strike of ours into her opportunity. But we'll find a way to shatter that shield, no matter the cost. 3 weeks after the Startup Defense Fund was launched, the Harringtons struck again. On Monday morning, major newspapers blasted the same headline. Kiara Johnson's company accused of financial fraud and fund misuse. Behind those screaming headlines was a stack of lawsuits filed in federal court, brought by shell companies secretly, backed by the Harringtons. The claims accused the Rising Stars Fund of lacking transparency, misusing funds, and even bribing the government for special treatment. In Kiara's office, the legal team pored over piles of case files, their faces tight with tension. One advisor muttered, "This isn't a real lawsuit. It's legal warfare. They don't need to win. They just need to drag it out until we bleed resources dry." Her company's stock dipped immediately, investors growing nervous. Harrington-friendly outlets piled on gleefully with headlines like, "Kiara's shield or just a sham? Hero or hypocrite?" As the boardroom sank under the weight of fear, Kiara sat calmly flipping through the case files, her face unsettlingly composed. After a few minutes, she looked up, her eyes sharp as steel. "The Harringtons want to drag me into the mud. Fine. But they've forgotten one thing. I was built by mud. And this time, I'll drag them down with me." The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. Fear gave way to fire. Kiara knew this legal war would be brutal, but she also knew it was her chance to expose the Harrington dynasty's true face to the world. Just days after the lawsuits were filed, Kiara launched her counterstrike. Instead of staying quiet and defensive, she called an emergency press conference at her company headquarters, attended by dozens of major news outlets. When she stepped onto the stage, there was no trace of worry. She stood tall, eyes blazing yet calm, as if she was the one holding all the cards. "Some people believe they can use the law as a weapon to strangle us," Kiara began, her voice ringing out. "But today I will show you the truth, who's really pulling the strings." Behind her, the big screen lit up with documents, internal emails, secret contracts, and most damning of all, proof that the shell companies behind the lawsuits were directly tied to the Harrington Fund. The room erupted. Reporters surged forward, cameras flashing like lightning. One shouted above the noise, "Do you have concrete evidence the Harringtons are behind this?" Kiara looked straight into the camera and answered without hesitation. "Yes, and we're submitting every piece of this evidence to federal investigators. If the Harringtons want to weaponize the law, then the law itself will turn on them." On social media, the hashtag #HarringtonExposed exploded. Investor confidence rebounded, and Kiara's stock surged upward again. Meanwhile, at the Harrington estate, Richard hurled his cigar to the floor, his eyes bloodshot with rage, because Kiara had just flipped their legal attack into a devastating counterblow. The very next morning, every news broadcast led with the same name, Harrington. But this time, not as a symbol of power, rather as a family under a cloud of suspicion and corruption. Major outlets ran bold headlines, "Harrington Dynasty Tied." To Shell Company Network, a legal nightmare for the century-old financial empire, Kiara Johnson flips the game. Senator David Collins publicly called on the Department of Justice to launch a full-scale investigation. Other politicians, once silent out of fear of Harrington influence, now spoke out too. If money can twist the law, then justice itself ceases to exist. On social media, outrage spread like wildfire. Clips of Kiara revealing the evidence went viral, drawing millions of comments. Finally, someone brave enough to expose the truth. The Harringtons aren't symbols of wealth anymore. They're symbols of greed and rot. Meanwhile, Harrington's stock plummeted. Investors fled en masse, terrified the scandal would drag the empire into collapse. At the Harrington estate, Richard sat in the shadows, his face carved with fury. He knew this was no longer a duel against Kiara. This was a war against public opinion, and for the first time in decades, the Harrington name was being dragged through the mud in front of the entire world. As the media, public, and political circles zeroed in on the Harrington scandal, the dynasty refused to sit quietly. An emergency meeting at the mansion brimmed with desperation. Edward slammed his hand on the table, furious. "If we stay silent, the Harrington empire will collapse within months. We need a strike big enough to flip the narrative." A strategist leaned forward, whispering, "There is one way, risky, but it could salvage our image. If we announce the takeover of a major company, a deal so massive it overshadows the scandal." Richard slowly raised his head, his eyes razor-sharp. "Yes, we'll unleash the biggest deal of the decade. A strike to prove the Harringtons still hold absolute power." His voice dropped, almost hissing through clenched teeth. "Draft the release. Tomorrow, we announce the acquisition of Orion Tech for $20 billion. The news spread like wildfire. Headlines screamed, "Harrington's launch $20 billion bid to salvage reputation." Orion Tech's stock skyrocketed, but the market buzzed with doubt. Many whispered, "Is this the desperate gamble of a dying dynasty?" At her office, when her aide delivered the news, Kiara only smirked. She stood quietly at the window, watching the city lights flare, then turned to her team. "They've just pushed all their chips to the center, and we will be the ones to flip the table." News of the Harringtons' $20 billion bid for Orion Tech sent shockwaves through the market. Financial networks buzzed nonstop, equal parts amazement and doubt. Some analysts commented, "This could be the deal that defines the decade," or it could be the most reckless gamble in Harrington history. At her office, Kiara quietly studied the confidential reports her research team had dug up. On the screen flashed contract drafts, internal financials, and most importantly, Orion Tech's hidden cracks the public had never seen. She turned to her team, her voice calm but firm. "The Harringtons think they can use this deal to bury their scandal. What they don't know is that Orion Tech is a Trojan horse. I have data showing Orion is hiding massive debt and a string of failed projects." One executive gasped, "If this leaks, the deal will collapse instantly." Kiara nodded, her eyes blazing. "Exactly. And I won't let the Harrington scandal be whitewashed by a desperate gamble. They've staked everything on this $20 billion deal, so I'll turn it into the bomb that blows them apart." She ordered preparations for a global press conference where she would unveil the confidential documents, not only exposing Orion Tech's rot, but also laying bare the Harringtons' reckless desperation. As the city lights burned bright outside, Kiara stood tall, a confident smile playing on her lips. The final strike was ready, and this time it wouldn't just ruin a deal, it would bring down an empire. On the day of the global press conference, the business world held its breath. Every major media outlet, millions of investors, and even everyday people tuned in, waiting to see what Kiara Johnson would do. On stage, Kiara appeared in a crisp white suit, walking with unshakable confidence under the bright lights. She wasted no time, opening with a line that sent chills through the crowd. "The Harringtons want to prove their power with a $20 billion deal. But the truth is, this deal is their confession of desperation." The hall fell silent. Then Kiara gave the signal. The giant screen lit up with confidential files. Orion Tech's massive hidden debts, internal emails revealing failed projects, and proof that the Harringtons knew it all but plunged ahead anyway. Reporters erupted, keyboards clattering like a storm. On social media, hashtags Dujar Orion scam and Gershak Harrington collapse exploded within minutes. One veteran investor stood up in the hall and declared, "This deal can't save the Harringtons, it's their death sentence." The news spread like wildfire. Within 24 hours, Harrington stock hit record lows, Orion Tech was under federal investigation, and the $20 billion gamble disintegrated into dust. At the cold, dim mansion, Richard sat frozen, a half-burned cigar in his hand. His eyes were empty. For the first time in his life, he understood that power no longer belonged to him. Meanwhile, as Kiara stepped out of the hall to thunderous cheers, she was no longer just a CEO who had won a battle. She had become a symbol, a living legend of Wall Street. The black woman once mocked and dismissed now stood as proof to the world. She could not only survive the storm, she could command it.